We have a couple good questions from the audience. One question is a bit more of a rant, but I think your perspective on it would be valuable, which is, when did we get to the point where the value of new code was more important than its functionality and security? Seems like we've dramatically bypassed systems integration testing and security. So your thoughts on that?
Wow, yeah. I don't have enough time to answer that. So there are a lot of things. One of the things that we need to get to is we've got to get to a point that our change management is in much smaller chunks. You can imagine if you're writing code and the code is 5 lines of change that I'm going to push into a production environment. It's a lot easier for me to secure those 5 lines of code via code review than somebody who tries to push up 5,000 lines of code into a production environment. So we've got to learn to break these changes up into much smaller chunks, and that will allow us to be able to release more frequently. The more frequently we release our code, the more often things are going to be scanned, so we can get through those scans to be able to say, this is the latest version of a container, it's the latest version of a VM.
I'm giving you a funny face, because all I could think of as you were saying this is, think pets, not cattle.
Exactly,
and
yes.
didn't we just all go through the think cattle, not pets thing?
That's right, that's
okay.
right, yep.
Plus ça change and all that. Okay, another question we've got, and I think it's a good one, because I thought, oh, that's obvious, and I don't know the answer. So transitive dependency, is that fourth party risk, or am I missing something?
No, I don't know if it's all the way to fourth party. The hardest part that we have is a lot of companies don't understand their open source risks that they actually have inside their organization. I am not saying that open source is bad.
Well, let's hope not.
Yeah, so one of my favorite things, I used to work at Red Hat, and one of the things that was very interesting when I started is, like, I'm a huge proponent of open source. And I talked to Greg DeKonisberg, who was heading up the Fedora community, and I'm like, we've got SSH. Anybody here ever use SSH to be able to log into a machine? Completely open source, right? How is it that the one thing that drives most of our deployments all around the globe is something that's completely open source, but when was the last time we had an SSH hack? And they are so proactive with that library for being able to make sure that it is always up to date, and the community is the first one to submit a patch. So those are the kinds of things that we've got to get to. We've got to get to a point that we're getting much better at fostering and maintaining open source projects. That if it's one of those things, one of the things that frustrates me to no end are people who just consume open source and treat it as free. Open source was always meant to be free as in puppies. Yes, I got a free puppy, but guess what? You get it home, I got to get it food, I've got to take it on walks, I've got to do, that is the open source model that you need to take. So you're constantly fostering. The other thing that's even awesome is that when you find a security risk or you find a change that needs to be implemented, encourage your developers to submit the changes back upstream. That's how open source is really supposed to work.
Okay, cool. And now I have a question for those of you who are playing buzzword bingo. It's late enough in the afternoon that you can take a drink whenever you hear the buzzwords. So the question is, where does SBOM fit in the CI/CD model? First of all, does everybody understand the question? Everyone who understands the question, raise your hand. Like 2 people, okay. Where does the software bill of materials fit in the continuous integration, continuous, what's the D for?
Delivery,
delivery software. Yep. In other words, how the hell are you supposed to check that your software providers are legit when you're in the business of shoveling the code out the door as fast as you possibly can?
So the analogy that I give, anybody here ever work, when they were in high school, they worked at their local grocery store? Anybody here? Anybody here ever stock shelves? That's your SBOM, right? Your SBOM is basically, I've got my cart and I've got 86 different things I've got to go put on the shelf, and I've got a list of all the things, what aisle they go to, and then I go out there and I go put them on the shelf. Well, what happens when you have a box that doesn't actually have a list of where it goes? What's the first thing that we do? Well, we just go push it in the back and let somebody else deal with it. That's what happens in the software process. We go ahead and say, hey, I'm expecting this version of this thing, and all of a sudden it doesn't show up, and we're like, oh, we'll let somebody else further on down the path deal with that particular change. So for me, the SBOM, it should be part of the requirements. You should know before you even start your CI process, what are the dependencies that I should have when I build my artifact before it gets deployed. And if I see something that is missing or I've got a version that has changed, then I should go back in and find out why it was changed. And it is the responsibility of everybody in the entire software development lifecycle every time that they are going through that process to check.
But how do you extend that out beyond your own organization? That's where the SBOM really comes from, because the SBOM is more like, hey, I know what this is made from. I know all these ingredients were responsibly sourced, and I know that the people that sourced those ingredients responsibly sourced them. So how do you get out beyond your organization in that one?
Yeah, what a great question. The one thing that you can do is you can use third parties. Mm-hmm. There are software that will go ahead and validate that it did come from a trusted source.
And then just build that into your CI/CD.
Build that into your CI/CD system. Other ways that you can do that as well is, this is the hard part, is you could just go ahead and ignore some of those and just build it yourself, which is one of those, I do not recommend that tactic. But if you're really concerned about a particular risk driver or a security driver.
Don't source it, build it.
Don't source it, build it.
Okay, and I'd love to go on with this, but we are well past the hour. So Lee, thank you.
Great.
Everybody, please thank Lee.